Okay, for this installment of Current Reflections on Citizenship and Democracy, we are joined by longtime tribal college leaders Ron and Deborah His Horse's Thunder. With nearly 60 years combined experience, Ron and Deborah have served the tribal college movement in a variety of capacities. Ron is Hunkpapa Lakota and has served as president of Sitting Bull College, the American Indian College Fund, and interim president of Little Priest Tribal College and Chandesca Chicana Community College. He also served the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe as chairman and currently works for his tribe. Ron holds a Juris Doctorate degree. Deborah is Nakota, originally from Montana. She holds a doctorate degree in guidance and counseling. She taught at a mainstream university and has worked in a variety of leadership roles at Haskell Indian Nations University, Fort Peck Community College, Ni Nakota College, and the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. Together, they form the consulting firm We and Associates, which has allowed them to provide professional services to a majority of tribal colleges on an individualized basis. Ron also launched the annual Future Generations Ride to confront historical trauma and raise awareness of past injustices suffered by the Great Sioux Nation. Both have been politically active for years, fighting for social and environmental justice, civil rights, and equality, and playing a major role in the movement to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. So thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you for having us on.
It's
Great.
a pleasure, Brad.
So you're both deeply familiar with the overarching issues confronting tribal colleges. When we zoom out and look at education policy and political currents nationally, how can tribal college leaders effectively influence conversations on policymaking that impact tribal colleges and Native communities?
Well, Brad, I think they've already done a very good job in terms of affecting policy when it comes to tribal colleges and their needs. And they've done that since the 1970s when they were able to get Congress or convince Congress to give them base funding, and have managed to get that increased over the years, as well as having Congress enact a number of legislative or bills through Congress that have contributed to the ability of tribal colleges to again meet their missions. But what they haven't done very well, in my opinion, is they have not assisted tribal communities or put a lot of effort into tribal communities and how tribal communities can shift, if you will, the focus on tribal policies for their communities. They haven't done a very good job of that. Their focus has been primarily tribal colleges, and not necessarily policies that affect tribal colleges or tribal communities and tribal nations.
But I would add to that in part, we are dependent on kind of having that national presence. And at one point, there was an office, the White House Initiative on Tribal Colleges, WITCU. And that office was designed to be able to work with other federal agencies to help advocate for tribal colleges and to help those federal agencies to meet some needs within our tribal institutions. Unfortunately, that office was once very active and now has pretty much been sidelined from what I observe. So if there was a way of heightening those ancillary offices or programs that were in place to help tribal colleges, I think that would help with the effectiveness.
When you ask the question about how can tribal colleges affect policy, both at tribal colleges and communities, again, they've done a good job for tribal colleges. But you have to understand the idea in trying to affect communities and the mindset of the community when it comes to policy is the mindset of Indian communities has always been the idea that tribal governments, tribal leadership take care of that. And the community mindset is that they only need to affect tribal leadership. They have not in the past understood that they also need to affect the Euro-Americans county leadership, the Euro-Americans state leadership, much less the National Congress, the American Congress. The Native community mindset is, again, not focused on the Euro-Americans' political machinery, but rather focused on tribal leadership. And then it had to be the tribal leadership who, if they could, try to affect state and national politics and policy. So tribal colleges need to understand that and try to implement programs or change the mindset of Indian communities so they understand that truly they need to be engaged not in just tribal politics, that is very local politics, but also state and national politics as well too.
And I think there's an example of that. As you know, Brad, I spent a lot of I grew up in Montana, and I spent a lot of my early professional life there. When we take a look at what Montana has done in terms of just the state legislature, trying to get that voice within the state recognized, it goes all the way back to like the late 1980s when people like Carol Juneau, who was the former president of Blackfeet Community College, or Norma Bixby, who was the tribal education director for the Northern Cheyenne tribe. They and other like-minded individuals saw the need to have state representation. And so they organized, and they went from one Native person in the state legislature in 1989 to today they have 11. And that's, in the percentage is like 7.3 of the state legislatures there, whereas the state population is more like 6.5. So if you just take a look at that ratio of representation, Native people are represented. They do have a voice. And it has taken a very clear articulation of a goal to have that voice. And so that is one way, I think, of addressing more effective policy. Having more policymakers at the table is by setting those goals in our respective communities, our respective states, and advocate to make those kinds of things happen.
Yeah, interesting. My next question has to do with our current political state here in the United States, I would say largely. We're so polarized politically today. And we're more polarized than we've been in a very long time. Why do you think that is?
You know, Brett, I think the polarization has just become more visible. I believe that the polarization has always been there. It's kind of the undercurrent. And we could go back and cite example after example of the injustices and stuff that have been a reflection of that polarization. So I think given the current national leadership, there's been a message out there that it's okay to voice those beliefs. But within Indian country, there's let me step back. I said we need the kind of leadership that will actually pull people together rather than fostering this us against them kind of mentality. And I think that when we look at our tribal positions haven't changed all that much. We continue to struggle to have our voice heard, as Ron indicated, that at the local county level, whenever we've encountered those Euro-Americans, we have found that the need, or the Euro-American organizations, we have found that it's so critical to try to get our voice heard. But first we have to educate and explain to others that we are different. We have a unique culture. We have a land base. We have a government system. And going back and just trying to explain to them even the meaning of treaties and tribal sovereignty and, our education system. When it comes to Native people, we're very historical in terms of when we are represented. So in terms of the current context, it's incumbent upon Native people, Native organizations, and some of our allies to try to explain to others what our positions are and why we advocate for certain kinds of things. What was embedded in those treaties, and why is it that we want to hold others to those treaties?
So when you talk about polarization, and Deb said it has always been there. And just to add a little bit more onto that is that in terms of polarization, it's really about Euro-Americans in control and minority populations and not being in control. So as the European population finds itself becoming slowly but surely a minority in this country, and you find more people of color taking political positions and taking not only position in terms of policy that needs to be changed, but also positions in terms of Congress itself. And when you find more people of color being elected to office, that the Euro-Americans are finding themselves in a unique position, and that is that they are slowly losing positions of power and influence in this country. And so there's always been a have and have-nots in this country, and it's always been European Americans who have and the minorities who haven't or who have not. And the European Americans are finding themselves wanting to keep themselves in positions of power. And so that's actually what the current administration got itself elected on, and it's continuing to do, and that is to foster the idea that unless we as Euro-Americans vote in a bloc, we're going to find ourselves not in positions of power anymore. And how they do that is by angering the European Americans and saying, look, these programs favor them, that is, favor the minorities, and we need to do away with these programs. And if we don't, they're going to rise up, and by the way, they're going to kill us all, so we all need our guns. So that's the polarization that I see. It's always been there, but now that the European Americans are finding themselves as slowly becoming minorities, they're afraid of losing their positions of power. And that's what the current administration has keyed in on and how they got elected. So it's always been there. It's just now become more apparent.
Yeah. This can be really tricky, I think, for tribal colleges and tribal college leaders in navigating this, because oftentimes they are interfacing with perhaps folks who don't maybe support their institutions broadly. So how do they navigate that kind of polarization, for lack of a better term, while also cleaving to their root values?
Well, tribal colleges actually have done a very good job of navigating, if you will, this polarization. Again, that has always existed. And one of the things that they've learned is this: that you can't just depend on one political party. That's what we're really talking about. Is political. Part of what we're talking about is political parties, and you have Democrats and you have Republicans. And to say that Democrats have always been the champions of tribal colleges isn't necessarily true. That there have been plenty of Republicans who have championed tribal college issues. And so tribal colleges have learned that in order to because we're such a small minority in terms of numbers in this country, and I hate to use the word minorities just because, but because we're smaller numbers, that we don't have great political influence. So we learn to rely on allies, if you will, in Congress, and they have been both Democrat and they have been Republican. So tribal colleges have done a good job of that. You have to learn not to say I'm just a Democrat and just depend on Democrats. And Indians, tribes have had to do that as well. So not just tribal colleges, but tribes themselves. Is you just can't say I'm a Democrat. And then in fact, there once was a time in this country when Indians, if you asked them what party they were, they said, well, I'm not really a party, but if I was a member of a party, it'd be a Republican Party. And the majority of the Indians in this country in the 1950s and the early 60s would have identified as Republicans. Why? Because Democrats in the early 1950s, in 1952 to be exact, passed what they call House Concurrent Resolution 108, which was the avenue by which Congress would terminate tribes. And it was Democrats who sponsored it and passed it. So it was Democrats who were terminating tribes in the 1950s. And because of that, Indians would say, I'm not a Democrat, I'm a Republican, if you ask them. And it wasn't until the civil rights movements started to take real hold in the mid-1960s that Indians started to go, well, maybe we are Democrats. But the point being is this, is that tribal colleges have been very good, and tribes also as well, too, in reaching across the aisle, whether they do identify themselves as Democrats today or not, but to reach across the aisle and engage both parties. And that's the only way we as a small group of people in this country are going to get things done, is to engage Congress as a whole and not just one party.
And the other part to that too, in terms of the tribal colleges navigating making the changes to the polarization, is our forte is education. And so by making this a priority, I mean, we have lots of priorities. So, and the tribal colleges do a great job of trying to address those various priorities with very little resources. But they are in a very unique position to provide the kinds of education to create future policymakers. And I think that that's an important aspect of the role that tribal colleges can play, in addition to what Ron was describing in terms of creating allies and creating the opportunity to have that voice. So in order to better meet the needs of our Native communities, to establish goals in terms of fostering students and future policymakers within those institutions. And so having them offer, currently the data says that none of the tribal colleges offer a political science degree, but we do have Native studies programs that provide the education in terms of all that historical information that's so critical to creating that level of understanding to help others and ourselves see how the political environment, the political context has developed. And so by establishing I want to say a theme of activism, or probably a better term is a theme of engagement for our students, and whether they set up political science degree programs or use the current avenues that are in existence, such as the Native Studies programs, is that they can engage, help our students engage in that political process, getting them to do internships with tribal leaders, tribal chairs, tribal council people, tribal legislators, having them engage in internships or actively run for positions within the county commissioner, um, as at the state level as well. You know, there are positions where students do have a role with the state legislatures. They have a role within the Congress. So making better connections and getting the students involved so that they understand the role, they understand the responsibilities, they are actually part of that process, so they can see themselves in serving in those roles. Because if we continue to isolate or not engage our students and others, you know, we will. It's more of a struggle to get people engaged if they're not familiar with that. So by getting students involved in the process, they know what that process is, and they know the expectations of the role. So, and they will be our future policy makers. They will be those at the table and carry our voices.
Yeah, that political engagement is so critical today. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the role of political activism, because being from Standing Rock, you were both involved deeply in the effort to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline from traversing traditional tribal lands. What can the No DAPL movement teach us about political action and involvement?
Well, one of the really critical lessons I think that we took away from that was the ability to have an effective message, a message that resonates with a lot of different communities, a lot of different organizations, helping people understand the importance of the environmental context that pipeline was damaging and the overall ramifications of that. And so out of that, creating that really effective message, utilizing social media in many ways to get that message out, because mainstream, or I should say Euro-American publications were not carrying the message. It was a very biased report. And so creating effective messaging, using the social media and other contexts to get that message out. And out of that was the creation of very strong allies not just locally, not just within the state, not just nationally, but internationally. It was an amazing experience to actually see how strong you could take that sense of creating relatives across the world and having a system of very strong allies in place, because everyone understood the impact on our respective lives, and not just our lives, but our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, those future generations, just how important that was to them.
One of the other lessons I think which can be learned from this is not only that you must have allies, that is, tribes that try to do things for so long by themselves, and they want allies that they had, if you will, have been a number of politicians that they managed to convince that their issue or the policy needed to be changed, or the issue was something that needed to be addressed by legislation, and then have a policy change. And so they've learned to create allies, if you will, with politicians. But this taught us a lesson, and that is that your allies need to be also not just other tribes and politicians, but other people, other grassroots people across the country and across the world. And when you do that, you can effectively get a message out there that's unified and draws attention to your issues. And so having allies is very important. So that's one lesson that's learned. One of the other lessons that's learned, if we're talking about citizenship and democracy, is that it's one thing to have your message delivered worldwide. It's another thing to get the policymakers to actually change policy. That hasn't happened yet, not in terms of pipelines.
Well, it has, but not to a negative response. having.
That's right, and that's the policymakers, the legislative bodies, both the state and nationally, have started to enact laws which, in fact, limit our ability to be activists, to be. They said protest, but it's actually to get out there and en masse and engage in political activism. They start saying you can't wear masks anymore. You can't have a gathering of more than 10 or 20 people around a pipeline or you'll be arrested. So the politicians have basically taken big oil money and said, okay, we will enact laws that make it easy, that make it harder for people to demonstrate and to engage in mass at these demonstrations. So politicians, again, take money from big corporations. But in terms of, so that's another lesson, if you will. But truly the lesson that we need to, so that the counterpoint to that is that as individuals, engaging in citizenship and democracy don't stop at being at protesting or demonstrating. Rather, convince your legislative body or legislators that your voice matters, that you're not going to just stop at a demonstration, but rather you're going to take those ideas and take them to the polling place as well too. That you're not only just going to stand on the front line and demonstrate, but you're going to go vote. That's a problem with many people in this country is they don't get out and vote. How many people voted in the last national election? How many people stayed at home and said, no, I don't like either of those candidates, and Donald Trump got elected? And so you have to you have to not only engage in protesting or demonstrations, but you also need to go out and vote. So that's another lesson that's learned. Another lesson that's learned is that the battle's not just in demonstrating. It's not just in Congress, but it's also the courts as well too. That battles need to be fought there, and you can be a lawyer if you want to. That's one side of the table, but you have to also, the other side of the table is the judges themselves, and who appoints those judges, or how do they get elected? How do they get in their positions to begin with? So that goes to the point that Deborah was trying to make earlier, that tribal colleges need to actually have teaching modules, if you will, whether they be full-term degrees or not, but at least like some modules that teach our students, our population, about engagement, not in just tribal politics, but in state and local politics as well too, so that they can effectuate change, not just at the tribal level, but at state level and the national level as well too, excuse me. So those are a couple of the lessons that I learned, but ultimately they need to take their activism, people need to take their activism and continue with it with their allies, and need to go out and vote and show the politicians that you're not going to just stop at demonstration, but you're also going to vote. And I think if there's a surge in voter turnout, that it will start to, the politicians will start to say, okay, well, I've got to pay attention to them and not just big money, and make laws that favor big corporations. Those are a couple of the other lessons that we'll learn.
Yeah, I mean, it's been shown that Native people in several critical states can swing the vote in those states and determine elections. So that's a good point. I wanted to follow up on this discussion of the No DAPL and its role. The tribal college movement was born in the late 1960s, early 1970s, a time of heightened Native activism. What are the parallels and or differences between that political moment, which produced the tribal college movement, and the post No DAPL reality?
Parallels. Well, I guess one of the parallels that I see is that there's when you look at the 1970s, that coming off of the civil rights, or in the midst of the civil rights issues and stuff, there's a I think there was a building of frustration that kind of boils over into anger and the need to take action. So we had, the Wounded Knee takeover at that time, and some really confrontational situations that resulted. And so the parallel, I think, is the same here when from that era to the pipeline issue, is that just the level of frustration that we experienced in trying to make our voices heard, to try to educate others about something that's really important to us, that we believe is important worldwide, which is our environment, our water. And so in terms of parallel, I think just the buildup of that frustration, it was very evident in both situations. Other parallels that you?
Well, parallels in terms of activism. And Deborah talked about activism with the Wounded Knee movement, and so that's a demonstration of that. In terms of tribal colleges and parallels, and Native communities themselves and parallels, that the tribal colleges in the early 70s were coming off again, as Deborah said, the civil rights movement. And it was the ideal that we can make change in our communities, and we must make change in our communities. And so it was actually young people, I believe, who convinced the elders that we need to have tribal colleges. And so they went to Congress and said, well, they started their tribal college, yes they did, but they needed funding. And so they went to Congress, and it took them a number of years for them to convince enough congressmen that these were a good investment, and they got tribal college funding. The difference that today and then is that tribal colleges did it almost by themselves. They didn't have any allies other than a number of politicians. And today, coming off of the No DAPL movement, we find that in order to make the change, if you will, or bring about changes, that we needed a lot of allies to do it. And so that would be the difference. There is a change that needs to take place, but the lessons that we've learned, we need to utilize them. It takes a lot of allies. And it also takes media. And the fortunate thing about today is that's different from the 1970s, is that you have social media. And in the 70s, they didn't at all. We were dependent totally upon the national media and the three major networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Today, you do have, of course, the cable networks, but they didn't even come either in terms of No DAPL movement until later in the game. But really carried the message, news-wise, was social media, that we connected with each other and weren't reliant on the national media to do it for us. And so we have an advantage today that the tribal colleges didn't have in the 1970s, that we can utilize social media and gather up our allies to support us at a moment's notice. And so that's one of so there are similarities in terms of there needing to be change, but now we have social media, and now we have the ability to gather allies and support almost immediately if the message is right. So that would be the difference, if you will. But the parallels are there, and that is that we need to start the engagement. We can't wait for someone to come in from the outside and do it for us, because if we talked about tribal colleges, that tribal colleges never would have been formed had we not pressed the issue. It wasn't benevolent Euro-Americans who came in and said, oh, you need colleges. No, in fact, it was just the opposite. They said, we can educate you, go to the state-supported institutions. It was the continued message. And even the politicians were saying that to us. Well, why do we want to support tribal colleges? They can go to the university or the state and with the state college within their states. And we had to educate them that they weren't doing the job for us. They were counting us as a number, as statistics, but the statistics really were that 95% of the Indian people who went to a state institution failed. So we needed to turn those numbers on their head. And as tribal colleges, we started to do that. And then politicians say, hey, you have data to prove that? And we say, yeah, we have data to prove that. Look at our graduation rate. Look at our retention rate. And it was then that politicians paid attention. So the cause was good, but it wasn't someone from the outside who came in and says, you need to do this. It was us who became actively engaged. So we still need to be actively engaged if we want change in Indian communities. But the difference is we have social media where we can gather outlets quickly.
And the really beautiful part of that, when you're doing that comparison between the 1970s and today, and the fact that we were able to establish the tribal colleges in so many of our communities, is that the net result is we have far greater numbers of people that have the formal education that's recognized in mainstream society. We have the people with the degrees. We have people with bachelor's degrees. We have our tribal colleges offer master's programs. So we have people with master's degrees. And then through partnerships and just the base preparation, we have people going forward and getting doctorates that after they have gone to the tribal college system. And so we have a much greater number of educated people, and I'd say educated in terms of the Euro-American concept of education. We have people that have Juris Doctorates, a number of people with Juris Doctorates. We have people with medical degrees. So we have a far greater number of people, Native people, that are in the system as a result of the push for education within our Native communities.
That's a good.
And I guess through that potential for actually making additional changes to continue to press to get policies changed, to have things in place.
So what is at stake for tribal colleges and Native communities in the forthcoming general election?
What's at stake? What's always been at stake, making our voice heard. What's at stake is convincing politicians that we count, we matter. And the only way you're going to impress that upon politicians is you got to vote. Without it, they don't care about us. They don't. They care about us as long as there is media attention involved in it, and they can say, I support that issue. But without the media attention and without an issue being in the forefront, they don't care. And so how do we make them care when the media is not shining its bright light on us? Is we get out and we vote. And it is those tight elections where our voice really makes a difference, that we can swing an election and put candidates in the office. But we got to get out there and vote. And they do count by county how many people showed up at the polls. And so if you can show that in your particular county, which is primarily Indian, that you got out and you voted, they'll listen. Even if the candidate that you endorsed didn't win, the other candidate that you may not have endorsed, he sees the numbers or she sees the numbers. They know when we got out to vote, and they know that in the past we haven't voted. They see those numbers as well too. And so no matter who you support, you got to get out and vote so they see that in your county that you will vote and you can swing that election when it's close.
And those candidates remember it. You know, when you talk to, or when you listen to people like John Tester out of Montana, you know, he knows that tribal people supported him very, very strongly, and he recognizes it. He does come out to the reservation. He you know, so he knows, and others do too. Others here read those numbers and know who supports them, and with those votes, we're asking them to be that voice for us.
Yeah. I have one final question, and that is in regard to political engagement. What advice do you have for tribal college students?
Well, as we've been talking about engagement, it's just so critical. I mean, there's no way to learn unless, no better way to learn but to be engaged. And so whether it's, hopefully it starts in the classroom, in our classes at the tribal colleges, and then moves on into the political arena. But to be engaged, work on political campaigns. How do you know what goes on with those campaigns if you're not familiar with it? Run for office. There's a number of positions locally that that students can run for, whether it's within the tribal community or the Euro-American community, the county community, the county positions and so on. But run for office. And as Ron has strongly recommends, vote. That it's so critical to be out there and vote. Get involved in helping others to get to the polls as well.
Ditto.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us here for Current Reflections for our issue on citizenship and democracy. Always a pleasure to talk with you both.
Well, thank you, Brad.
So talk to you again.
Okay. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.